Okay, if you're just joining us, thank you. My name is Greg Mint, Executive Director of NEBC, and this is going to be a great webinar. It's been a couple of years since we've done webinars, and we're going to get back on track with doing more. And this is the first of a two-part series on climate and environmental regulations. In addition to NEBC's in-person conferences across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, we're going to be partnering with our members to deliver a series of virtual workshops and other timely hot topic discussions in the months ahead. But I especially want to thank Maul, Foster, and Alongi for stepping up to help deliver today's webinar and part two, which you'll be seeing later this month. And some of you have signed up for that sort of two-part series. Others will be able to sign up as well, and you'll get more information about that at the conclusion of this one via email. Just as a reminder, as we get started today, if you have any questions, use the Q&A feature. That's the function we will be using to pose questions to the participants and the presenters on this webinar. Additionally, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to get access to that, and you can always reference this in case you have to jump off early or you'd like to go back and listen to this presentation again. We will also be sharing the presentations in a PDF format. So look for those in the coming days, and you'll have the ability to do that. So if you're not interested in taking lots of notes today while you're enjoying your lunch, we'll have those shared with you. With that, I hope you're able to join us right now. And I'm going to introduce Kat Klass, environmental scientist with Maul, Foster, Alongi. She's going to kick off today's webinar. And with that, I'm just going to sit back and enjoy the presentation. So thank you. Thank you, Kat.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Klass, an environmental scientist at Maul, Foster, and Alongi, working out of our Bellingham office. I'll be wearing two hats today. I'll be doing a bit of moderating and then presenting as well later on in the session. First of all, just wanted to say thank you to NEBC for hosting this and providing a platform for our two-part session, and to all the speakers for being willing to share their knowledge and their experience working with these programs. A little bit about what we'll cover today. So as we know, West Coast states are expanding climate and environmental regulations that affect private industry. And the programs that we'll be focusing on in this webinar kind of span four topics. So on the first topic of greenhouse gas emissions regulation, we have Chad Darby and Fawn Robideau from the MFA presenting about the climate protection program in Oregon and the Cap and Invest program in Washington. On the topic of building energy use, we have Hicks from MacDonald-Miller Facility Solutions presenting on the building performance standards in both Oregon and Washington. And then on the topic of packaging, end-of-life management, myself and Alia Miles from Stoel Rives will be talking about extended producer responsibility programs for packaging in Oregon, Washington, and California. And lastly, we have Kelly Beskin from Stoel Rives, who will be giving an overview of California's climate risk disclosure laws, more commonly known as SB 253 and SB 261, related to greenhouse gas reporting and climate-related financial risk disclosure. As Greg mentioned, today is part one of a two-part series. So the goal for today is to give kind of a practical overview of these programs and policies. How did we get here? What does compliance look like? And what might be on the horizon? In our second session, which is on April 23rd, we'll spend more time talking about the specific strategies for compliance with these programs, any lessons learned that speakers would like to share, and best practices. But we can certainly answer questions related to these topics if you have those questions today. I'm not going to make you wait 3 weeks and then come back. See, I think that's everything for the first part of this. So I'll pass it over to Chad and Fawn to talk about the Climate Protection Program and Cap and Invest.
Thank you, Kat. So my name is Chad Darby. I'm a principal with Principal Air Quality Scientist at Maul, Foster, Alongi. I'm teaming up with Fawn today to talk about the climate protection programs in Oregon and Washington. I'll be specifically speaking about the climate protection program in Oregon, and Fawn will cover Cap and Invest in Washington. Fawn, did you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Thanks, Chad. My name is Fawn Robideau. I am one of the air quality specialists who works with Chad, and I have some experience with the Cap and Invest program. as well as the climate protection program. So I'm excited to talk uh, on both subjects today. Thanks, Chad.
Yeah. So our format today is that we're going to do this together, and our slides are going to have both Oregon and Washington on them together, so that as we go through various topics, you can kind of compare and contrast and see how the programs are similar or different. We thought that might be more instructive than just throwing everything at you about Oregon and then throwing everything about Washington at you. Fawn, could you advance the slide? So first of all, we thought it would be good to talk about how did we get here. And I'm not going to make any kind of the intent here is not to make any kind of political commentary. Um, but just in terms of the history of what happened, Oregon did try in 2019 and in 2022 and into 2020 to pass a cap and trade program, and they just didn't have a quorum for a vote. So it really didn't go anywhere. And then Governor Brown, our governor at the time, issued an executive order that basically required the DEQ to develop a program for climate protection. And so climate protection program version 1.0 was underway, and that program was adopted by the DEQ in 2021. However, it was invalidated in 2023 by a court of appeals. And I think it's important to say here that it was invalidated not on substance, but on procedural issues. So when people ask me, are we stuck with this program forever? My answer is maybe, but it's not been challenged yet on substance. So maybe, at some point it will be. But after the Court of Appeals decision, the DEQ went back and created a new program, version 2.0. They didn't just fix procedural issues. There were a number of substantive changes to the program. For instance, those who are familiar with the first version knew that there was a best available emission reduction analysis one could do to figure out what was cost effective for their facility to do. That is gone. And we'll talk about the mechanics of the program going forward. But the climate protection program, version 2.0, was adopted in 2024. And it's kind of odd in that there's a first compliance period, which is 3 years, and then all subsequent compliance periods after that are 2 years. And when we get to the next slide, we'll talk about why that is. Fawn?
Thanks, Chad. Well, conversely, in 2021, the Washington legislature adopted a package of legislative and budget proposals to combat climate change and prepare the state for a future low carbon economy. So the three major bills included were the Climate Commitment Act, also known as Cap and Invest, the Clean Fuel Standards, and the hydrofluorocarbon transition. These bills, along with the existing zero emission vehicle policies, kind of set the path for Washington to meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals, which include greenhouse gas reductions by 95% below 1990 levels and a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So while Oregon is moving through their legislative process, Washington Cap and Invest is already working through their first compliance period. Now we can speak to some of the program goals. Chad, do you want to speak to the Oregon Climate Protection Program goals?
Yeah. So the thing that I want folks to really take away from the graphic here, which by the way was prepared by the DEQ, is that there's a glide path. Although glide is not how it's going to feel. It's not going to feel like we're just settling into a final goal. It's going to be a tough slog to achieve the priorities here. But it looks like a glide path. And basically the idea is that between the baseline period and 2050, we will see a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. The original baseline is 2017 to 2019, so right before COVID. In this graph, you'll see two glide paths. One was the former program, which is gray. Blue is the new program. And so following the blue program, you'll see that it starts to decline and then it bumps up in 2028. And we will talk about the regulated entities in a second, but I'll just say that what we have is basically four different groupings of entities that are regulated under this program, two of which are already in the program in the first compliance period, and two which will join in the second compliance period. And that's why it bumps up and then it continues downward from there.
Well, conversely, in Washington's Cap and Invest program, they have established a glide path that sets requirements to reduce emissions by 45% below 1990 levels by 2030, 70% by 1990 levels by 2040, and 95% by 2050. Within the program, covered entities can purchase or receive allowances equal to their emissions through quarterly auctions or free allowances.
The other thing I want to say while we're still looking at these graphs is, you see a steady progression down in terms of emissions. If you start to look at this by percent reduction year to year, right now in Oregon, for instance, the percent reduction year to year looks like 3.5 to 4%. If you were in 2049, that same amount of emissions reduction would be a 20% plus reduction year over year. So even though the statewide goal reduces pretty steadily, that chunk is going to be out of what is remaining, and it's going to feel like a steeper and steeper curve to the regulated entities. So when we're looking at these nice gentle curves, the thing I just want people to keep in mind is what is happening on a year over year percentage drop basis. So that's gonna feel a little bit tougher. All right, let's talk about the covered entities. Who's regulated by these programs? So in Oregon, I mentioned that there's really kind of four groupings. At least that's the way I think about them. And the first grouping are fuel suppliers. So you get your local natural gas distribution entities, of which there's three major ones. And then you got your liquid fuels and propane suppliers. And they're already in the program. And the threshold for them to be in the program is that the emissions resulting from the fuels they sell would be 100,000 metric tons per year. But in 2028, that's going to drop to 50,000 metric tons for the threshold. And by 2030, it drops to 25,000. So we're going to see more regulated companies being pulled into this program over the next couple compliance periods. And you don't have to sell a tremendous amount of fuel to hit that 25,000 mark. So there's going to be a lot of small to medium players that are going to be pulled into this program by 2030. The other two groups are direct natural gas sources. It's not so much sources, it's the sources that use the gas. But if you're an entity that buys direct from an interstate pipeline, that's direct natural gas sources. And there's only a small handful of those in the state of Oregon. Um, and then there's the emissions intensive and trade exposed sources or facilities. And these are the businesses that have operate in certain sectors that face strong external competition, but also have fairly intensive um, greenhouse gas emissions. And what Oregon has done is first identify them by sector and then set a cutoff of 15,000 metric tons of CO2 annually, carbon dioxide equivalent annually. If you're at or above that, then you would be pulled into this program if you're in one of those sectors. And I think there's about 40 facilities in Oregon that fall into this EITE category. And we'll talk a little bit more on subsequent slides about what that means.
And in Washington Cap and Invest program, they have similar entities called into the program. There's the fuel suppliers, so natural gas entities, liquid fuels, and propane suppliers. There's also the direct natural gas sources, electric utilities, waste to energy facilities, railroads, and those EITE sources but in the Washington Cap and Invest program, they are EITE sources that emit 25,000 metric tons of CO2e or more annually. So a little bit of a different threshold for the Washington program. Currently, there are about 40 EITE facilities in the program. They're a mix of building products, electronics, food processing, petroleum, primary metals and glass manufacturing, and pulp, paper, and cement manufacturing, with the largest group being the petroleum refinery and chemical manufacturing. So there's 10 facilities in the program under that category.
So one of the questions we often get is, what about the facilities that aren't EITEs? Well, as fuel suppliers to those sources, either have to invest in ways to reduce their emissions, or they have to sell more biofuels, which are more expensive, or they have to buy basically allowances or instruments, as they're called in Oregon, because they can't reduce their emissions, and so they're essentially paying for allowances that allow them to emit above their cap. Those costs will get passed along, and it's estimated that very significant increases in fuel costs will be passed along to those entities that are buying that, and that's everybody. It's the small facilities that aren't EITEs. It's also you and I driving our car, heating our homes, and so that's how those costs will be distributed. So there's usually a lot of questions around what an EITE is and how it's going to comply and what that really means and why they're in a separate program. I think, first of all, the reason that they're put in a separate program is um, these two states realize that if the regulatory environment is too stringent, then these facilities will shutter and leave the state, and then they'll go to a state where there isn't any kind of climate program, and they'll be back to emitting what they would have. So achieving something here is better than the loss of jobs, loss of tax revenue, and ultimately having no effect on the emissions from those types of industries. So it's an attempt to make this program um, more workable for companies that find themselves in, stiff competition, but also emitting a fair amount. And so the idea behind EITEs in Oregon is that your compliance will be determined based on your emissions intensity. So instead of just having a cap on your emissions, what you'll have is a cap and a downward glide path on the amount of emissions that you can have per unit of production. Um, and what's the advantage of that? Well, it's really that if you can figure out a way to achieve that, then you could certainly continue to produce more. Your overall emissions from your facility aren't capped. So let's say you're required to reduce your emissions 90%. Well, in 2050, you could be emitting the same amount you are today, provided that it's due to having 10 times the production you have today, but your emissions per unit of production have actually gone down 90%. So there's nothing from preventing these facilities from emitting more, provided that the emissions efficiency, for lack of a better term, per unit of production is downward, and it's on that glide path. Um, so their metric of emissions intensity, like I said, is anthropogenic greenhouse gas produced per unit of production. Um, and these EITEs will be given a carbon intensity baseline and receive free allowances up to that glide path. The carbon intensity baseline is something that's being worked out right now. I'll talk about that more on a subsequent slide, but there's rulemaking going on right now around how this program will work for the EITEs. So nothing is set. DEQ is currently collecting information, meeting with the EITEs. I think they've met with most of them one-on-one. If you're from one of those facilities, hopefully you've had a meeting like that. They're also holding listening sessions. Um, but what they're trying to do is collect enough information to do a rulemaking that would decide things like what is the baseline period that's selected for these facilities? Um, how is that calculation done? What's the rate of decrease in emissions we expect from these facilities? And then things that are near and dear to my heart is will there be backstops? Off-ramps or emergency provisions so that if a facility has a bad year, the ability to get emergency provisions, if they can reduce emissions or they show that they've reduced emissions as much as is possible with current technology, that there would be some sort of off-ramp. So we're trying to get those sorts of things and working very closely with DEQ on input on those sorts of things. And this rule is expected to come out in 2027.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, the selection, how the baseline is selected and whether or not there's flexibility to that baseline through the program can really have large impacts on the success of the program. Conversely, in Washington Cap and Invest, facilities there's a couple different compliance baseline determination methods. So facilities with a mass-based baseline receive free allowances equal to their average annual emissions from 2015 to 2019 baseline years. And then also facilities with a carbon intensity baseline receive free allowances in two stages. The first stage, EITs receive an initial allocation equal to their average annual carbon intensities during the years 2015 to 2019. And then in October 24th of 2024, Ecology conducted a final reconciliation or a true up of free allowances for the intensity-based EITEs using their verified 2023 data. So the true up amount is then added or subtracted from the initial allocation for the next emission year. So this flexibility within the Cap and Invest program resulted in a little over 430,000 total allowances for EITEs, which were then added as added to the baseline allowances in the initial period. Another flexibility in the Cap and Invest program is that Ecology does allow adjustments to allocation baselines for EITE facilities before the start of the next compliance period. So any adjustment to the baseline must be based on significant changes to emissions or significant changes to production data. And that's really vital for some of these facilities because by their nature, EITEs are trade exposed. So a lot of their production and energy use is market based. And this is one way that the Cap and Invest program allows some flexibility in response to those market fluctuations.
Okay, well, we're back to talking now about everybody, not just the EITEs. Under the Climate Protection Program, for every metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions that a facility or fuel supplier or entity emits, they'll be responsible for having an instrument. An instrument is equal to 1 ton of emissions. And as we go down the glide path, fuel suppliers, EITs, everybody is going to be given instruments up to their portion of that glide path. And then beyond that, it may be necessary to trade with other facilities or entities to get instruments from people that maybe have banked them, or to even purchase them from community climate investment program or fund entities that have been approved by DEQ to take money and go out there and make emission reductions. So companies are going to have three options with compliance instruments. One is you can bank compliance instruments if you get more than what you need based on your emissions, and whoopee for you, because you can put those in the bank and save those for the next compliance period or trade those with somebody else. You can trade compliance instruments with others if you have surpluses or you have needs and prices to be determined. And then lastly, you can, this is irritating to me, DEQ will call it earning credits. It's really buying credits from CCI entities. And you can purchase in the first compliance period up to 15% of your need, and then no more than 20% in subsequent compliance periods. And that's important to note because all of us into a corner. If you think about a fuel supplier, for instance, if they mostly sell gasoline, there's not a substitute for that right now. So they can't achieve reductions. And within 5 years on the glide path, they'll be at the point where they'd have more emissions than they could purchase CCI credits for to offset, unless they just start selling less fuel. So that's the kind of the future that we're looking at here is this going to get known as cap and bankrupt, or will it be, a workable program? And so we'd really like to see some legislation that lifts the lid on the percent that could be purchased, because we do think there are segments of state regulated entities that will not have an option to keep reducing emissions and may need more than 20% purchasable as an offset.
Thanks, Chad. And in the Washington Cap and Invest program, some of the expectations for compliance, of course, include annual reports and third-party verification audits. Emitters are required to use allowances to cover their annual emissions. So similar to Oregon, one allowance is equal to 1 metric ton of CO2e. Free allowances equal to the facility's baseline are given, but there is that ever declining cap. And the Department of Ecology sells allowances through auctions, and Cap and Invest participants can buy and sell from each other. Over time, Ecology will issue fewer allowances, so emitters kind of have to make a choice for them what is the most cost-effective strategy for complying. The allowance costs are market-driven, so allowances have swung from $27 per allowance to as high as $70 per allowance. And in the first auction, many facilities have had to purchase additional allowances above their free baseline. And this is an example of how this is a trade, or EITEs are trade intensive, and the program is subject to market fluctuation.
Yeah, I think I should note for Oregon, I mentioned the prices to be determined if you're kind of trading between facilities, but if you're needing to buy the CCI credits, that price is set, and it's starting at 129 and going up from there. So it's quite a bit higher than Washington and California. Next slide. So where are we now? We're close to wrapping up here for one thing. Fuel suppliers, the first two groups are already in the first compliance period, and EITEs have submitted permit applications. DEQ's holding those sessions. We're hoping that 2027 will have the public comment period, public hearings, and then eventually the adoption of the rule. I will say that EITEs that I've spoken to are generally in support of this EITE rulemaking. They're not necessarily all in support of a climate protection program, but given the choice between just an emissions cap like everyone else or being regulated by emissions intensity, um, folks generally seem to be much more on board with an emissions intensity scheme because of the flexibility it gives them in finding ways to achieve compliance. So, and to grow their, eventually grow their business despite having declining emissions per unit of production.
Well, conversely, Washington is 4 years into the Cap and Invest program. The first allowance period ends this year. In period 2, EITEs will receive 97% of their baseline emissions. And naturally, many sectors are wondering what the impacts of a declining cap on emissions will mean in the context of the additional economic costs, not only from this program, but also from the cost impacts from their Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Some interesting guidance Ecology has recently released includes 2 guidance documents. The first is that Ecology is allowing upward adjustments to the reduction schedule for EIT facilities. So Washington Ecology has the authority to make upward adjustments to the reduction schedule for EITEs ahead of the next 4-year period, so starting in 2027. If a facility can demonstrate that emission reductions are not technically or economically feasible, they had the opportunity to submit an application for adjustments as of March 31st, 2026. Another interesting guidance that Ecology released was the ability to request adjustments to the allocation baseline for EITEs. I mentioned that in a previous slide. But this allows Ecology the ability to make adjustments to allocation baselines for EITEs if there's been a significant change to emissions or product data. So applications for both of those adjustments just closed as of March 31st, 2026, but it's great that they do have some flexibility built into this program for different sectors and facilities to adapt.
All right. So just wrapping up, we wanted to tell you that today was, an overview, obviously a very brief overview. But the next webinar is where we're going to really get down to, how are facilities complying? What are the options? What does it look like to do the accounting at the end of the compliance period? In Oregon, what are the community climate investments? And if you're one of those folks that down the road is unlucky enough to not be able to reduce your emissions and can't get more than 20% of your needed instruments purchased because you need 25 or 30%, what does potentially enforcement look like under these programs? So stay tuned for that. I think that's what a lot of people will be interested in hearing more about. But we will take questions here at the end if you have any today.
Wonderful. And next session for the Cap and Invest program, some interesting topics we'll dive into are what strategies have Washington facilities adapted to plan and prepare for the next declining cap? Is there anything that Oregon can learn from Washington? Conversely, Washington is pursuing linkage with California and Quebec market. So the 3 jurisdictions issued a joint statement expressing mutual interest in leaking carbon markets and are collaborating to develop the draft linkage agreement. So depending on when linkage process steps and regulatory changes are completed, the 3 entities could begin operating a linked market as soon as 2027. Further, Ecology is currently considering how to handle EIT allowance allocations for the years 2035 to 2050. And in January of this year, Ecology put out a report to the legislature on leakage mitigation policies for EITEs within the program. So we're hoping to dive into these kind of new, interesting evolutions in the next session. Thank you, everyone.
All right, got a couple questions in the chat, a few more rolling in in the Q&A box, rolling in at the end there. The first one is, do natural gas power generating facilities qualify or fall under EITEs?
No, I mean, as far as I know, electrical generation is exempt in Oregon. And the EITEs are really the trade exposed manufacturers.
Okay. Second question, is there a way for covered entities to get CO2e credit for recycling activities?
I'm not aware of that in Oregon's program currently. However, there is, an energy accounting that takes place as part of the greenhouse gas program. So if, for instance, you were making something on site that was using energy, natural gas, or a fuel, and there was a way to recycle some of that back, then yes. But if you're talking about just recycling waste and trying to take credit for the energy that went into making that material that you purchased and didn't fully use, there's nothing like that in the program.
Okay, got it. Then last question that we have up right now, is rulemaking incorporating representation from the governor's Prosperity Council, or how can the CPP align with the state's budding economic development goals so they're not at odds?
That's a great question. And I've even asked DEQ how much they take a step back and look at a big picture of things. I'll just give you a brief example. We've encouraged DEQ to exempt pollution control devices that use energy because if they're mandated by a different regulation, how's a facility supposed to get rid of those? So there, but what I've been told is that, there's still a lot of compartmentalization and not really anybody looking from a big picture standpoint at how all this kind of knits together. But I do understand that DEQ, like other agencies, are really engaged in looking at this prosperity initiative and how it affects future regulation. And I imagine that the flexibility that we will see or not see in the EITE program will be reflected in that. Because obviously, um, if you squeeze anybody too hard in terms of fuel costs or an EIT over reductions they have to achieve, then you potentially have jobs leaving the state. And we've already seen that. We've already seen folks or companies closing and leaving over the air toxics program and the costs associated with that. And I think we will see that due to the climate programs as well once the cost gets excessive. Um, I'll just make one statement here too that I hear from clients is that one of the unintended consequences of these programs that DQ and our government isn't fully aware of is that a lot of these trade exposed facilities have multiple manufacturing facilities around the US. And what they've been telling me is that they have a limited amount of dollars to invest. And so they invest those in states where they see a future. And right now they're not investing in Oregon because of the regulatory environment. And there's other reasons too, but that's a big one. And so even if somebody doesn't just pick up and leave tomorrow, 10 or 15 years down the road, when they haven't invested in keeping their facility operated and in good condition, it becomes a business decision that it's cheaper to have something new in another state than to deal with a facility that's not been maintained here. And so I think, we have to be cognizant that leakage, as it's referred to, could happen over a decade or more, not something that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to both of you for presenting a summary of, I know, two very complex programs. That was no small feat what we asked you to do there to condense it down, but we appreciate your efforts. I know I certainly found that pretty enlightening. I think now we will transition over to Drew's presentation on building performance standards in Oregon and Washington.
Great. There we go. Hi. Thanks, Kat. Hi, I'm Drew Hicks from MacDonald-Miller Facility Solutions. My role is our Building Performance Program Manager, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the building performance standards in both states. A little bit simpler than what Chad and Fawn got into, but it is sort of a roll-on of a lot of the regulation, the Climate Commitment Act in Washington and the CPP in Oregon. Here we go. There we are. I hope that's working. Yeah, climate resilience and building performance. What does it mean and how do we plan? So I'm going to, kind of like the others, I'm going to keep it a little high level today and give an overview. What we're looking at is just climate resilience in general. What you'll see, Chad and Fawn did a great job of sort of introducing this already. So you'll see a couple of my slides I'll breeze through. We'll get into the performance standards and then talk a little bit about getting started. And ultimately, we see these building performance standards as being a capital planning exercise for the owners and operators of their real estate. So I was happy to see a lot of my graphics here were the same as Chad and Fawn. This talks a little bit about the greenhouse gas, the emissions reductions over that 1990 baseline. I won't dig too much into the context here because Chad and Fawn did a really good job of setting that up. Similarly, Oregon's Executive Order 2004 has similar reductions targeted in 2030 and 2035 and 2050. Now, when we talk specifically about the building performance standards that have been adopted in each state, this is how Oregon got here. Started in 2020, and basically owners were notified last year in July of 2025. There's a lot of similarities between Washington and Oregon for the building performance standards. In fact, I was on a webinar maybe a year and a half ago with the Department of Energy, ODO, in Oregon, who administers the program. And they basically said that we took Washington's Department of Commerce Clean Buildings Performance Standard, we copy pasted it, and we did a find replace of Oregon for Washington. And so there's a whole lot of similarities there, which makes it really easy for the owners and the operators that have properties in buildings in both states. The House bills in Oregon were House Bill 3409 and 3630, which again is a follow through of the same legislation. The big thing I like to point out here is that the first bullet point of installing 500,000 heat pumps. In general, it's a comprehensive state strategy, just like in Washington, for the reduction of energy and emissions for transportation and buildings and everything else. What's unique about the building performance standards is that it's the first time that legislation has actually affected existing buildings, as opposed to the building code or the energy codes on significant tenant improvements and new developments. What the states have done is they've taken the entire building stock. They looked at the size of the buildings and all of the buildings in the state, and they've ended up breaking it into two tiers. So in Oregon, they both have tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. And in Oregon, any hotel, motel, and non-residential building over 35,000 square feet is considered a tier 1 building. What they consider tier 2 buildings are multifamily, hospital, school, dormitory, and universities with a gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or larger, or those hotel, motel, and non-residentials with a GFA between 20,000 and 35,000 square feet. So similarly, in Washington, the Tier 1 buildings start at 50,000 square feet, where the Tier 2 buildings are between 20 and 50,000 square feet. And in Washington, all multifamily buildings are considered Tier 2. The requirements for Tier 1 and Tier 2 are slightly different with the initial compliance cycle. Future compliance cycles, which come every 5 years, will start to align those Tier 1 and Tier 2 standards in the future. A couple key things to note here, though, is that Oregon has kind of, I like to say, given a little bit longer runway for the Tier 2 buildings, and they've also included in their Tier 2 buildings hospitals, schools, dormitories, and universities for all square footages over 35,000 square feet, where in Washington, multifamily buildings are the only Tier 2 buildings over 20,000 square feet. What the standard defines a qualified person in such that a qualified person must be the individual submitting to the state the required documentation. So a person having training expertise and a certain amount of functional experience and professional experience doing building energy use analysis. So the real simple way to think of this is just like an architect putting their stamp on the drawings or an engineer putting a stamp on their drawings to get a permit. If you are a licensed architect or engineer in Washington or Oregon, you are considered a qualified person. Some other criteria that allow you to be a qualified person are a BOC2, Building Operator Certificate Level 2. That is administered by Building Potential, which is formerly NEEC. Other ways to become a qualified person is through being a commissioning professional, a qualified energy auditor, a certified energy manager, or an energy management professional. In South Seattle, there's also a bachelor's degree that would allow an individual to be considered a qualified person. So it's key there in the sense that the responsibility of the building performance standards are on the owners of the property, which are often executed by the operators and the property managers or the facility managers, but ultimately the submission to the state needs to be done by a qualified person just to put that stamp on the documentation. These are some key elements of the law. The two graphics on the left are for Oregon, and Washington is on the right. So again, looking at that building stock, it breaks into tiers, Tier 1 and Tier 2. And so in Washington, or excuse me, in Oregon, the Tier 1 buildings over 200,000 square feet have a compliance deadline of June 1, 2028. So the compliance deadlines really fall into what is like a 3-year tranche. In Oregon, it's 2028, 2029, and 2030. The square footages, as you can see, they're over 200,000 square feet in Oregon is the largest that are due first. Between 90 and 200 are due in the second year, and between 35 and 90,000 square feet are due in 2030. Similarly, in Washington on the far right there, the tiers break down. What's really nice, like I said, with that copy paste is they use the same day, June 1. It just happens to be in Washington 2 years earlier. So this June in Washington is the first deadline for building performance standards for all buildings over 220,000 square feet. They have a pretty similar breakdown between 90 and 220,000 for that second year, and then between 50 and 90,000 for the third year. Now, all Tier 2 buildings, their compliance date falls right in the middle, July 1 in 2029 for Oregon and July 1, 2027 in Washington. So again, Oregon is just 2 years behind is the simple way to look at it, but the requirements are very similar. There's a little bit of difference in the square footages, and that's all based upon the building inventory. There's approximately 13,000 buildings in Oregon that need to comply and 27,000 buildings in Washington that need to comply, meaning a building that's over 20,000 square feet. So there are penalties potentially for non-compliance. As well as incentives available. In short, it is $5,000 for a Tier 1 building and up to $1 per square foot. So can be pretty significant fines for non-compliance. Non-compliance does trigger potentially expensive mitigation plans. So the recommendation is always to get generally compliant before your deadline. Third-party collections are permitted. We could see a future where non-compliance could affect the transfer of properties potentially. At tier 2, the penalty is a little bit less, 30 cents per square foot, but not insignificant, especially for small building owners of a 20,000 square foot building. The EUI is energy use intensity. I'll talk a little bit about what that is later. It's a pretty simple calculation, but if your energy use intensity target by 15 points, you're considered a high energy user. And some of the early adopter and some of the incentive programs out there through the utilities, through the Energy Trust of Oregon, really focus on those high energy users and supporting those owners and getting under target in time for their compliance deadline. There's also in Washington State currently an incentive program open, which if awarded, the incentive is 30 cents per square foot, which is basically the equivalent of the non-compliance penalty. There are exemptions to the building performance standards, and we like to say that if your building is exempt, you still must be compliant via exemption. Just because your building is a candidate for exemption doesn't mean it's automatically exempt. Federal and tribally owned buildings are exempt. Newer buildings or buildings without a certificate of occupancy or a TCO for a 12-month period within 24 months of their deadline can file for an exemption. Also, the standards state average physical occupancy less than 50% for a calendar year, but I feel like in practice that's a little misleading. It's not physical occupancy as in are people coming to your building, are they badging in? It's really looking at the least occupancy and vacancy of the building. So if your building is more than 50% vacant for a 12-month period prior to your compliance date, you potentially have a candidate for exemption for physical occupancy. Also, manufacturing facilities, a lot of those that were touched on by Chad and Fawn that'll be addressed with the cap and trade and the CPP. For those buildings, those manufacturing facilities that are considered a factory group F or IBC high hazard group H, that square footage is allowed to be exempted from the building performance standard. Also, agricultural structures, I just think of anything that's got that doesn't have people in it, that's got livestock or grain, those structures can be exempt from compliance. And also there's potential for buildings with financial hardships. You can see at the bottom there's a few options for financial hardship, not as easy to get, but it's kind of one of those cross the bridge when we get there. We're not seeing a lot of customers with a good case for a financial hardship. Again, we really recommend the best thing to do is work towards general compliance by meeting your targets. So what do you do? How do you get started? This is a screenshot of the Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a federal program administered by the EPA, but basically it pulls utility data from the utility providers and it breaks it down at the building level. So part of the requirements in submitting is that you stand up if your building does not already have an account in the Energy Star Portfolio Manager, that you have to stand that up, get that set up, and get your Energy Star Portfolio Manager pulling data from the utilities. The Department of Commerce and ODO in Oregon are going to get their utility data from Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So that's how it's verified. This here is showing you again just some snapshots of what it looks like in the Energy Star in the portfolio manager. I mentioned earlier EUI, not the EIT, not the IET, but the EUI is the energy use intensity and gross floor area. So the real simple way to think about the math here is you take your total consumption in kBTUs from any utility, whether that's fossil fueled or electricity, you divide that by your gross floor area, and that equals your energy use intensity. This is the metric that we use to compare buildings, to compare to targets. It's basically kBTU per GFA. The key here is that the GFA is measured at the outside of your building. So for operators or owners, it's not usable or leasable square footage, but you want to include the envelope to understand the full energy use intensity of the building. Understandably, your windows, your roof, your insulation, your R factor is going to have a lot to do with your energy use intensity. So what you do in calculating the energy use intensity, there's actually 113 different types of activity types. And so this is showing an example of a floor plan where you can see in red there's administrative offices, the blue is an urgent care, and the green would be non-refrigerated warehouse. So each of these different uses have different targets. So what's shown here, and this is based on the ASHRAE Standard 100, there's 113 different targets. And so you can see the columns on the right there. There's Western Washington and Eastern Washington. These are the federal climate zones, Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon. So if you're a healthcare facility and you're an ambulatory surgery center in Western Washington, your EUI target, these targets are set by the states, but based on the ASHRAE standard, your EUI target would be 90. If you were in Eastern Washington, understandably, it gets a little bit hotter, a little bit colder. It's going to require more energy to maintain your building at a comfortable temperature. The EUI is 96, a little bit higher. What Oregon has done, Oregon's targets in general are going to be a little bit lower than Washington's because Oregon has adopted the 2024 ASHRAE Standard 100, where Washington is working off of the 2018 standard. So right away, the Oregon targets are going to be a little bit lower, 10 to 15%, sometimes up to 10 to 15%, depending on the activity type, the defined activity type. Similarly, or I should say subsequently, buildings that are permitted after July of 2026 are considered newer buildings, and those buildings, their EUI target is dropped by 15%. Presumably, any building that's built in the last year that was built to code is probably going to be under target, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. If you're building to the energy code's a lot more strict than the ASHRAE standard from an energy target perspective. So when you're building to code, you're most likely going to be under target. These standards in general were set based on a report from a few years before to 65 to 70% of the existing building stock should make their target their first compliance deadline target. I mentioned earlier that these cycles roll every 5 years, so we assume that targets in the future will come down. There's some other factors that go into adjusting your energy use intensity and the target based upon operating hours. There's also some other minor factors that go into that. Really, we look at this all from the perspective of the first step is sort of the energy benchmarking of your building to really understand where you are today and how you measure up against the EUIT or your target. So, as I mentioned, the exercise to calculate your energy use intensity and your target is called energy benchmarking. So that's the first step. If you're above target, then you may have to take some measures and energy efficiency measures to get below target. If you're below target, there's additional all buildings, there's additional documentation required that gets submitted to the state to be considered compliant with the standard. This is 3 different examples sort of the benchmark results. These tables that you're seeing here is what we call the EUI workbook, the calculator. This is provided by the states and allows individuals and qualified persons to do the calculations to determine whether or not you are above or below target. So on the left is a building that is under target. You can see how the different use types and the different normalization factors get you a total. It's kind of a weighted average of the different energy use intensities, and ultimately you can be under target or over target. In the middle is an over target example of a benchmark calculation. And then on the right talks about how if you're a manufacturing facility at 51%, then you could be considered exempt. So both under and over target buildings additionally have to comply by completing the generation of an energy management plan, an EMP, and an operations and maintenance program, an O&M. Those 2 pieces of document get submitted to the state, regardless as if you are under or over target. Now, if you are over target, and depending on how high you are over target, there may be some additional scoping, auditing, ASHRAE level 2 required to identify measures to get you below target. That is sort of that. And then I mentioned the high energy users at 15 points over target. There's a pathway called the investment criteria pathway, and it's aptly named because it requires a full level 2 audit and an attestation from the ownership that they will implement all the cost-effective energy efficiency measures in order to get them below target. With an exemption filing I mentioned earlier, there is compliance via exemption. So if your building, for example, was a manufacturing facility and you applied for an exemption, that exemption gets granted by the Department of Commerce or ODO, but that exemption filing has to be done every 5 years just to reaffirm that your building hasn't changed use type. I'll talk a little bit more about if your building is above its EUI target. This is an example of an energy audit, and you can see here there's different EEMs, such as a HVAC controls upgrade or a boiler system upgrade, lighting and controls upgrades. So you can see the ROM costs. And then the second columns there are sort of a high and low on a ROM on your EUI reduction, as well as calculated energy savings. So this is kind of the results of a lower level energy audit. You can see down at the bottom there, the ROM EUI reduction for this project was between 21 and 31 points if all measures were implemented. This is some of the most common energy efficiency measures. As we know, building controls and analytics, renewable energy is always great. Many operators and owners have been going through lighting system upgrades and removing fluorescent tubes and getting more energy efficient lighting systems in there. Of course, there's always your boiler and chiller plants. As I mentioned before, consider looking at your roofing and your building envelope to reduce your energy use and improve the efficiency of your building. There's always HVAC and quality, and then there's plumbing and water conservation. So these are just the most common EEMs, and typically your ASHRAE Level 2 audits are going to dig into all of these potential EEMs. I mentioned before the documentation that's required per the ASHRAE standards 100 and 180. That becomes the energy management plan, which we look at as a living document for the building. The energy management plan will stay with the building, will live with the building, will be updated as the building is updated. And the operations and maintenance program is really the tasking and the frequency associated with the work, the preventative maintenance, and everything that you're doing to take care of the building. This is an example of the Washington Department of Commerce compliance forms. So these get completed by the qualified person. The form also needs to be signed by the owner, the qualified person. We call him a QP, the energy manager, which is similarly a newly defined role in the legislation, and the Department of Commerce or ODO in Oregon. So basically what happens is they go on Form A, talks about verification that you've done your weather normalized calculations for your EUI, you've created the EMP, you've created the ONMP, and you provide a snippet of the capital management plan associated with that building. Similarly, I mentioned the Energy Star portfolio manager. So you provide the data to the authorities having jurisdiction here to make sure that they can connect to the Energy Star portfolio manager and pull that utility data to verify the calculations. Another part of the form in the submission is the qualified person will evaluate the capital management plan. And part of the submissions in the energy management plan looks at what capital projects have been done in the prior 12 months and what capital management projects, CapEx, are planned for the upcoming 12 months. Commerce and ODO really want to see that the owner and the operator have a plan for managing the energy use in their building, especially over time, and reducing their emissions and energy use, working towards those goals in 2040s and the 2050s. This is a little example of kind of an asset management CapEx report here, looking at the different equipment and then putting, over a 15-year timeline, what those costs, that capital outlay may be. These little sorts of snippets get included into the energy management plan, and Commerce and ODO would like to see those again, just to know that the ownership group is thinking about this. So I mentioned in the beginning that in the long run, this really does become a capital planning exercise There is documentation required to maintain compliance with the building performance standards, but ultimately, it's really going to be looking at your building long term and planning for that significant energy use and emissions reductions in the next 15 to 20 years. This is another example of calculations of ROM of the EUI and utility savings. The big, I want to reiterate here, for those buildings that are high energy users, it's always best to get started and get going, because the implementation of some of these EEMs can take some time and they can be costly, and finding the funds and allocating the funds for that, depending on the ownership structure, can be a hurdle. This is a great little graph that we put together with BOMA, the support of BOMA, the Building Operators and Managers Association, a few years ago. This looks in general at the center trend line. There is what's it going to take to reduce your EUI by 5, 10, or 15 points, just looking at the capital outlay. The 2 points that we kind of look at here is if you're about 7.5 points over target, you're looking at about $5 per square foot in capital investments. And the other one I mentioned, the high energy users being 15 points over target, potentially looking at $10 per square foot. So it can be quite costly to reduce the energy use of your building from a capital perspective. So what we always like to say, it's never too early to get your ducks in a row. Time is of the essence. In Washington State, again, the first compliance deadline for the largest buildings is in 3 months. And then these deadlines, when you overlap Washington and Oregon, there's a deadline almost every single year, and they go on in perpetuity. This little chart here kind of helps, this graphic helps owners understand what it may take if you're over or under target, just thinking about a general compliance timeline. So in the middle there is the benchmarking process. You can expect 2 to 3 months just to get all your utility information, your area takeoffs, your building floor plans, do the calculations, and do a site visit and verify the site utility type, activity types, and do the calculations for your benchmark. If that benchmark shows that you're over target, again, it requires some auditing, potentially an industrial grade audit, the design of those EEMs, the implementation of those EEMs, and then the ongoing M&V to verify that those EEMs were effective. So in general, we really simplify it to looking at, hey, it could be up to 3 years if you're over target to get this stuff done. Now, what I didn't talk about today was alternative compliance pathways. I'll talk more about that at the next webinar, number 2. But there are conditional compliance pathways if you're over target. And again, I mentioned the investment criteria pathway. Those allow you to shift your deadline into the future with the attestation and the agreement that you're going to be implementing these EEMs, you're going to be doing your audit, and you will be outlaying the capital to execute these measures. Down at the bottom there shows if you're below your EUI, we call this general compliance. It is, again, create your energy management plan, create your O&M program, and then submit it. So you're looking at probably 6 or 7 months to do that, just to get through all the back and forth with Commerce, and Commerce has a portal set up that has to get logged into and access granted and that sort of stuff. So again, I will dig into more of that in webinar 2, get a little more granular on what that looks like. That's what I've got today. I would love to turn it back to Kat and answer any quick questions now, or stick around to the end for the deeper Q&A.
Thanks, Drew. That was really thorough. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A feature at this time, so we can go ahead. I guess I'm handing it off to myself and Alia Miles from Stoel Rives. Next topic we'll be covering is extended producer responsibility for packaging.
Great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm glad to be here talking with you all. As Kat said, I'm Alia Miles at Stoel Rives here in Portland. I recognize some names on the attendee list from other areas of my practice. Great to see everyone, and here we all are navigating these new emerging regulatory landscapes for our clients. So we're moving on from those presentations on greenhouse gas emission, building performance. Thank you. Those have been great. This is a short session focusing on extended producer responsibility laws. And our goal, Kat and I, is to provide you with a high-level understanding of these laws, who has compliance obligations, and what does that mean. I'm going to kick things off, and then I'll hand it off to Kat. And for starters, it's helpful to step back and ground ourselves with some regulatory history and context regarding the concept of extended producer responsibility. It's not the most intuitive descriptor. I find everyone sort of wonders, what is that? The concept is built into the name, though. It basically is these laws extend responsibility for downstream environmental impacts of certain products back up the supply chain to producers, the companies that design, manufacture, import, or sell products into the market. So broadly speaking, EPR programs are built around a pretty simple principle. If a business puts a material into the marketplace, it should bear at least some of the cost of helping the jurisdiction manage that material once it becomes a waste. And from a public policy perspective, the thinking is that producers are best positioned to influence product packaging, material choice, recyclability. And this is not a new concept. EPR is not an entirely new concept in Oregon and elsewhere. There are other programs that some of you may have bumped into either in your own life or in your professional life. Examples are drug take-back, paint care, electronic waste. We've all sort of bumped into those programs. What is relatively new in the United States is for the extended producer responsibility concept to apply to paper and packaging and plastics as part of the packaging. And that is really what we're talking about today. While similar frameworks have been in place for paper and packaging in Europe, as well as in British Columbia and some other jurisdictions, the US has not had these kinds of wide-reaching EPR laws until quite recently. But they are really here and they are really taking off. Since 2021, 7 states have enacted comprehensive EPR laws for packaging and paper. Oregon was the first to bring the program into operation. That's sort of how I got involved. We don't get to be first on things very often, so this has been exciting. But the Recycling Modernization Act was the first to come online. Colorado and California now have EPR laws in effect, as do Maine, Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington, though those last were in later compliance timelines. We will talk about that in the second session. Now, each of these state laws have this common framework, common policy goals, but they are not identical. There was no copy and pasting here, like the true story. Basically, what we find is that even though they're very conceptually similar, the details are significantly different, both as to the scope of the covered materials, the exemptions, the fee structures. There are big differences. And we will talk about those in the second session on EPR. But for today, we wanted to really make sure that everyone comes away with an understanding of what is the same with all the programs. And before I turn to those kind of broad similarities, I did want to mention that Kat and I wanted to make sure that everyone was clear that today we are going to focus on the producer compliance side of EPR laws, not so much the public entity and service provider sort of fee receiving entities that do play a very significant role in these laws and essentially are the beneficiaries of the fees collected from producers. But from a compliance standpoint, we are going to focus on producers. So at a high level, every packaging and paper EPR law requires essentially the same elements to be in place for compliance to be triggered. If a business is the producer of a covered product or material that is sold into or in a state and is not otherwise exempt, that producer is required to join the Designated Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO, and Kat's going to talk a little bit more about that. Report data on the quantity and weight of covered products to that PRO, and pay fees calculated by the PRO to fund the program. And on paper, those elements do sound relatively simple, but in practice, evaluating whether a particular entity has compliance obligations is pretty tricky, and it is also a critical threshold step because some of it is not as straightforward as you might think, and the definitions all vary from state to state. I, in working with producer clients, have seen teams, with the best of intentions, both sort of over and underestimate their obligations, whether by, not having identified an exemption that they might benefit from, or taking responsibility for a product that the law actually assigns to someone else in the supply chain. So there are intricacies to all of it that make that threshold step of determining obligation and the scope of each entity's compliance obligations a really critical one. And I think, for anyone other than sort of the simplest of business models, building, a really solid compliance strategy involves taking a hard look at the statutory language to make sure that you've got a clear understanding of how your entity really fits in and how the law applies. So with that foundation in mind, I'm going to hand it off to Kat to talk about what compliance looks like once an entity has determined that it has producer responsibility for a covered product.
Right. Thanks, Alia. So yeah, once you've determined that producer responsibility is in play, the next step is to register with that producer responsibility organization, or PRO. Again, a lot of acronyms flying around today. The PRO acts on behalf of its members to meet a state's recycling obligations and manage compliance. And in all the states that have active programs so far, the PRO is the same group, a group called Circular Action Alliance, or CAA. It's important to note that if you register as a producer and don't submit a report, you will be contacted by Circular Action Alliance and the appropriate state regulatory agency because they see you as being out of compliance. So just to highlight there again, Alia's first point, it's really important that you're looking at how these laws apply to like a producer's products and whether they're covered products and whether an entity is the responsible producer before you register to save yourself potential compliance pathways. The next step, again, sounds much easier just saying it out loud or looking at it on paper. Next step is quantifying or estimating the packaging that's sold in each state. So for companies with hundreds of products, or maybe they have really complicated packaging formats, data collection can be a really significant undertaking because you're pulling data from product sales. Maybe there's packaging bills of materials that live in a different location. You might have to go back to suppliers to ask them what the specific material structure of an item is. There's basically a lot of it's kind of a new way or a new method of collecting, manipulating, updating, and reporting this form of data that previously hasn't, reporting has not been required for it. And then on top of that, as Alia mentioned, we kind of have this patchwork of state programs that have very different scopes and material categories because we don't have a federal EPR program at this point. So on the step of quantifying or preparing the data for reporting, I think technical support is something that can be very valuable. And what that looks like it depends on a producer's covered products. So it could mean bringing in a consultant to help with the data collection and preparing data for reporting if an organization is short on capacity and can't hire someone else or shift those responsibilities to another team member. That's kind of the role that I've been filling with one of MFA's clients, a food manufacturer. Another option for technical support, some companies can dedicate an employee or an internal team to manage their EPR compliance. So in that case, technical support might be software that helps prepare the data for reporting once you have submitted, like once you put in your sales data and your bills of materials and that sort of thing. And then the last kind of step in the general compliance pathway is reporting the packaging materials and weights to the producer responsibility organization and paying the resulting invoice. So each covered material category has its own fee. The fees are measured per pound, and the material fee is multiplied by the material weight that a company reports. So just as a really quick example, paperboard, think like a cereal box. Easy example, paperboard in Oregon, the fee is 8 cents per pound. So if a company sells 100 pounds of paperboard in Oregon, there's now an $8 fee associated with that, and it scales up rather quickly. And materials are priced differently, kind of depending on the ease of recycling and how well they kind of fit into the existing recycling stream. So I have the Oregon fee schedule that shows the covered material categories and the different prices. We could look at that at Q&A if someone is interested in seeing what's going on there. Let's see. So to summarize, I think the kind of 4 steps in the compliance pathway is determining if and how the EPR laws apply to an organization's products. Second step would be registering with the pro. Third step, preparing data for reporting. And then the 4th step, reporting the data and paying the resulting invoices. Just a little bit about the program specifics. So I think Oregon was the first one. Oregon and Colorado has a program. Those programs are fairly harmonized. California is a little bit of kind of the odd one out here in terms of they have a greater number of material categories, and they also have some requirements around reducing plastic packaging at the source. So incentivizing producers to either eliminate or reduce their use of plastic packaging. And then Washington's program is still in the early stages. So a final program plan isn't expected until 2029. So that's pretty early on in program development. And then just a quick look at kind of where we are now and what's coming up. So the big reporting deadline for packaging EPR compliance is May 31st of this year. So full reports are due for Oregon, Colorado, and California. And that's kind of like the full number of material categories. And then for Washington, Maryland, and Minnesota, simplified reports are due. So that's just 8 different buckets of material categories. And I'll pass it back to Alia, I think, just to quickly talk about some of the legal challenges that have occurred here.
Yeah, so just focusing on Oregon, the National Association of Wholesale Distributors sued DEQ with claims that the law, the Recycling Modernization Act, is in violation of both the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, as well as some Oregon constitutional provisions. And that litigation is moving through the pipeline. The judge in that case did grant an injunction that restrains DEQ from enforcing the law against just the members of the organization that brought the suit. That, of course, has created a scramble of excitement while other entities try to understand what that means for their compliance obligations. And DEQ and CAA have continued to, make press releases and make it very clear that the law is in force and in effect, other than as applied just against those narrow parties who brought that suit. So more to come on all of that. And I think that, even though, like I said, these laws are conceptually not entirely new, it is really new to see the concept applied in a law that has such far-reaching impacts up and down the supply chain, products, of all types, business to business, it does raise some different legal issues. So it'll be interesting to see how the laws withstand these challenges.
Yeah, all right. I think that's all from us. Not seeing any questions in the Q&A feature. So we're running a little bit over time at this point, and we had said this would be over at 1:30. So I think we'll go a little bit over that. I would encourage everyone to stick around for Kelly's presentation. I know I am very excited for that one. It's a program I've been tracking for a while, and just looking forward to hearing more about it from an expert.
Thanks, Kat, and to let everyone know, my presentation's, hopefully around the 12-minute mark. So just to give people, how much longer? Hopefully just another 12 minutes or so. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. I'm going to jump right in. As Kat said, my name's Kelly Beskin. I'm an attorney at Stoel Rives, and I'm going to be talking about California. At this point, I say newish because they were signed into effect, or they were signed in 2023, but they go into effect this year, California's climate reporting laws. And those are Senate Bill 253 and 261. You hear them called SB 253 and 261, or sometimes the 200s. So here's how I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes. First, I just want to level set on what these laws are and at a high level, and who they apply to, what do they require. I also want to briefly touch on some litigation that's going on because these laws are being challenged, and one of the deadlines is currently in flux and has been stayed for that. So it's important for you to know that, as you're building your compliance strategy. And third, I want to wrap up with some very practical what should I be doing now takeaways. This area is evolving both from a regulatory and litigation perspective, but there are smart steps that companies can be taking without necessarily overreacting. So as a bit of background, as many of you may know, California has already been regulating greenhouse gas emissions for the past 2 decades. They already require emissions reporting from some facilities. So these laws are kind of the next step of that, in California's kind of general overall climate goals and its portfolio of laws. With these laws, California is really saying, let's look at entire companies now. So at its most basic, SB 253 is about greenhouse gas emissions reporting, essentially how much carbon is associated with your business. And SB 261 is about climate-related financial risk. That is how much climate change could affect your business, finances, and operations. And the overall goal of these laws is really to improve transparency on corporate climate-related risks and emissions, and to inform consumers and investors so they can be considerate of that before their, for their business considerations. So who does this apply to? Maybe most importantly, I'll go over the exemptions first, because if you're lucky enough to be one of these categories, maybe you can go ahead and leave or check your email for the next 8 minutes, because this won't apply to you. There are some important ones here: federal, state, local government entities, certified, nonprofits, so the Internal Revenue Code, insurers. So, some people don't have to follow these laws, but otherwise they apply to everyone who meets the following criteria. So assuming that you don't fall into one of those listed exemptions, your next question is to ask yourself whether you meet the 2 criteria for these laws. And they are pretty much the same, with one slight difference between. So the 2 criteria are whether or not you meet the applicable annual revenue threshold. And the second is whether you're doing business in California. So let's look at each of those separately. The first prong is your global annual revenue. So 2 important facts here. It is not just California revenue. It is the entire business's revenue. And it's revenue by gross receipts, which means you're not deducting costs, you're not deducting losses. It is truly everything that's coming through the door. So if that number is 500 million, then you're subject to SB 261, which is the climate-related financial risk report. If you're at 1 billion, you're also subject to SB 253, which is the emissions accounting and reporting law. If you're at the 1 billion mark, you're subject to both, of course. The second prong is asking whether or not you are doing business in California. And really, for purposes of here, there are kind of 3 main criteria that you should be thinking about. One, is your company organized in California? 2, are you commercially domiciled in California? So for example, you might not be organized there, but are you headquartered there? Are significant, major business decisions being made in California and directed from California? And 3rd, which ends up getting companies, likely companies outside of California, like those in Oregon and Washington, who maybe don't have any necessarily physical presence in California, is asking about your sales to California. So you can meet this by 2 sub-criteria. 1 is whether your sales to California exceed $757,070 or exceed 25% of your total sales. So a couple things here. 1, that 757 number changes every year. It adjusts for inflation. So that's don't marry that number. That you should always check the Franchise Tax Board every year to see how that number is adjusting, and it will continue to go up. The 25%, it can be a little confusing when you read this, but basically if your sales are under 757,000, you can still be considered doing business if let's say half of your sales are from California. So if you do $1,000 worth of business and $600 is from California, you're doing business in California. Of course, then you're not meeting the first prong, but for that doing business purposes, that's kind of how you look at it. So that's kind of at a very high level how you're deciding whether or not you are subject to these laws. It's really about how big of a company are you and what kind of business are you doing in California. It is completely detached from your emissions and any kind of other similar criteria that you think would apply. For example, you might say, I don't have any kind of emissions related to my business. It doesn't matter. If you meet these criteria, you need to think about complying. So SB 253, as I mentioned, it requires annual, so you have to do it every year, global greenhouse gas emissions reporting. Again, global here is something that catches people off guard. No matter if you are subject to SB 253, you have to report on all of that entity's emissions. So for example, you may do business in California, but if you have owned assets in all 50 states, maybe even abroad, you're reporting on all of that. It's the whole package. In terms of what you're reporting, and some of these terms were thrown out earlier, but maybe for those of us or for people on the call that aren't as familiar, when we're talking about emissions inventorying, it's divided into scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 are emissions from sources that you directly own or control. So think, if you're in a factory setting, a broiler that you own and the factory is having emissions, company-owned vehicles would have emissions. And scope 2 relates to emissions from purchased electricity. So what are the emissions that get generated as a result of you buying electricity to keep the lights on in your building? That information is information you have to get from others. So basically beyond scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 become challenging because that's not data you're able to pull from your own sources. Scope 3, which I'll talk about briefly on the next slide a little bit more, is basically everything else upstream and downstream of your value chain. And that's kind of where this law gets really overwhelming for people because that encompasses a lot of different categories. In terms of the requirements, scope 1 and scope 2 reporting is due August 10th, 2026. That deadline has been set by the regulations, which aren't completely final, but I think for all our intents and purposes, this is the date people should be using and relying on. And in 2027, scope 3 emissions will be due, although that date is TBD. And then finally, emissions reporting needs to be conducted pursuant to the greenhouse gas protocol for emissions inventory. I call these the dreaded scope 3. So the greenhouse gas protocol has 15 different categories of scope 3 that you can, scope 3 emissions that you can look at. What's a little difficult for people now is that under the greenhouse gas protocol, scope 3 emissions reporting is voluntary. So people generally pick a few categories that maybe are easier to crunch or maybe more or less, impactful in their business. As you can see here, some of these aren't going to even apply to everyone. For example, franchises or leased assets, it's specific to the company. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of effort that goes into compiling this data. You have to look at emissions from suppliers, customers, logistics, product use, disposal. It requires a lot of coordination across procurement, your operations team, finance, and sustainability teams. And building those processes for the first time is extremely time intensive. The challenge with the law is that CARB, California Air Resources Board, that's in charge of implementing this, has not given us detail yet on how it's going to implement Scope 3 and whether or not you're going to have to report on all of these, or at least do a de minimis evaluation, whether it's going to phase in certain categories or phase in certain industries, and other industries might not have to report on Scope 3 later. It's a difficult position because this is a lot of work, and to the extent you don't have this, I would advise you start to move on it, but it is kind of hard to know what exactly you should be doing when there isn't regulation or really guidance yet on what that means and what actually Scope 3 reporting looks like. So next, SB 261, which is the climate-related financial risk report. It's different in tone and objective from SB 253. It requires companies to prepare a report once every 2 years. The report needs to be published on your website. And the report looks at how climate change could create financial risks and steps, and identifies the steps the company should identify the steps that the company has looked at to address those risks. And so unlike SB 253, which requires compliance with the greenhouse gas protocol, there are several methodologies that you can use to complete this report. The deadline for this report, as set by statute, was January 1st, 2026, but don't panic, there's a big intentional red asterisk next to that, and I'll get to that later. So SB 253 reports, it's not a prescriptive checklist, but it wants companies to conduct a good faith evaluation of their risk and explain how those risks are managed using a framework that really examines these 4 core pillars. So governance, that looks at oversight, and SB 261 is expecting transparency in who is responsible for climate risk oversight, how that information flows to leadership, and how climate considerations are incorporated into governance and decision-making. Strategy, companies need to evaluate the material climate-related risks, and this includes physical and transition risks. And this is how these risks could affect the company's business model, financial condition, or long-term strategy. What's important here is I've had clients, when they think of risks, they're just thinking physical risks. They'll say, well, my company's not on the seaboard, or we're remote, so we're not affected by X, Y, and Z. But physical risk is one part of it: sea rise, temperature change, drought, etc. But there are also other risks, such as transitional risks and regulatory risks. For example, how do developing consumer expectation and desires affect your company? People are wanting now, there's a general shift towards certain types of products that meet certain metrics, and what's that going to do for your business? Also, from a regulatory perspective, how are these increasing climate-focused regulations going to impact your business? Is your business, for example, especially if it's in California or one of these specific states, is your business going to be regulated out of existence? That's a big question for oil and gas companies at this time. So it is really a thorough evaluation of everything kind of climate related and what that means for your business. For risk management, we're looking at how climate risk is identified and managed in your company. And then for metrics and targets, the CARB is going to want to see what metrics you use to evaluate your risk, and where applicable, what your targets or goals are that kind of inform your mitigation or adaptation plans. The big takeaway here, though, is that it's okay if you haven't done this yet. And especially for metrics, you don't need to say net neutrality or carbon net zero is your goal. It's not prescribing anything. It just wants to know what you are doing, and that can certainly evolve, and there kind of is some expectation that these reports will evolve, especially as you start to be a little bit more deliberate about your evaluation of risk. And I would, as a natural kind of conclusion from that, think more about it, develop more strategies, etc. So really quickly, there is litigation. There's 2 cases. The difference between them is that the ExxonMobil case is an as-applied case. So ExxonMobil is saying, based on my specific facts, these laws are unconstitutional as applied to me. For everyone else in the world, that case is then of limited use because that holding will be specific to Exxon. Companies can certainly extrapolate from that. But the main case, and the case that everyone is really watching for a couple of reasons, is this first Chamber of Commerce case, because it is a general constitutional challenge to the laws on their face. They're saying these laws, no matter who you apply it to, are unconstitutional. There's a lot of kind of litigation history and jargon that is involved, but what you need to know is that based on the current posture, the SB 261 deadline, that January 1st, 2026 deadline that I put a red asterisk near, is currently stayed. It's not being enforced, and CARB has acknowledged this. So unlike, what Alia was mentioning, where there's kind of some regulatory uncertainty, CARB has come out and said, yes, we know, we're not enforcing this. Some people have chosen to voluntarily comply. The docket is open, but you don't have to. What you need to know is that we are waiting to see whether or not this stay will remain in place until we reach a final decision on the merits, or whether it's going to be lifted. And so right now we're waiting for the Ninth Circuit to come back with its decision on that. So two things will happen. One could be that it's going to lift the stay, in which CARB is going to release a new notice that will say, in so much time, now you have to submit. We're updating the deadline. You need to submit by X date. Because the statutory deadline was January, we're thinking that clients aren't going to have a ton of time. So people should be ready kind of in short order to comply with whatever CARB says. We're not sure if it will be weeks or months, not expecting a long runway though. The other potential though is that the stay will remain in effect, and we'll have to wait until a final decision on the merits happens in this case, which probably wouldn't happen until late this year at the earliest. So that basically it would sort of maintain the status quo until that litigation resolves. And then there could be appeals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of kind of uncertainty there, but the main takeaway is SB 261 is stayed. SB 253 is not. That August deadline is still live. This brings us to the most practical question. What do I actually do with all of this? First step 0.5, don't panic. CARB understands that many companies may not be engaging in these activities. For SB 253, there was actually an enforcement notice that went out that said that for emissions reporting, you can basically just submit whatever you had in place, whatever sort of systems and metrics you have in place as of December 2024. So you don't need to start revamping everything and make it perfect for the August reporting deadline. CARB gets it. You can sort of report what you have. The same is with SB 261, and I was kind of mentioning, CARB understands that, you may not have conducted this sort of self-reflection yet, and so, it's going to be different from you. These, your climate disclosure is going to look different than Coca-Cola's, who's maybe already doing this and, has a 100-page TCFD report. They get that this is new for people, and they're going to, for the next session, we can talk about more enforcement risks, but CARB is definitely understanding that this is a lot for people and new, and their expectations, I think, are appropriately adjusted for that. So that aside, first confirm your applicability. Many companies, they assume they're out of scope until they actually start checking their tax returns and actually start looking at California sales. There's kind of an added nuance here for companies that file unitary tax returns. If you file a unitary return, all the revenue of the companies underneath that filer are aggregated and attributed to the unitary filer. So this is not an easy inquiry, and it's not straightforward, even though I don't know if it seems like it to you or not, but it can be very difficult, particularly for companies with more complex organizational structure, which is often the case when you're talking about billion-dollar entities. So check to see if this applies to you. Second, inventory what you already do. You may already have emissions data for certain operations, scope 1, maybe scope 2. You may already have risk reports that you're developing, or maybe you've already just discussed it internally. Also, if you're part of a greater organizational network, what has your parent done? These laws do allow for some consolidation at parent levels. This has particularly been relevant for my clients that have European parents, because Europe's sort of ahead on these requirements. So if you have a European parent, they may already be doing this, and you can submit that and not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel here. So, the goal is to build on existing work and not necessarily hopefully you're not starting from scratch. But to the extent that you are, step 3, begin preparing, start thinking about what it looks like to put these data and governance infrastructures in place. How are you going to begin to monitor this? How are you going, if you are going to report, what does it look like, and what do you want to say, and how are you going to develop it, And as I mentioned, though, for scope for this year, for 2026 reporting, there is that enforcement that said, just give us what you have. but that's just for 2026. 2027 is going to be scope 3, which is based on 2026 data. And that data is much easier to collect in real time than after the fact. So I certainly wouldn't wait until 2027 to start thinking about how you're going to take stock of scope 3. But again, there has to be some strategy aligned with that because there is a lot of ambiguity here. So it is a delicate balance, and every company has to evaluate what this is going to look like for themselves in light of the regulatory uncertainties that we have. And lastly, which should just kind of be an overlay for everything, monitor the litigation because it will be impactful on your reporting deadlines, and monitor regulatory developments. CARB is currently in the process. The regulations will be an iterative process. They're just now starting the regulatory process for writing regulations that further detail how to do emissions reporting, particularly scope 3. So that is going to be an ongoing evolving thing where new rules and regulations are going to come out, and more guidance to kind of help you frame that. But it's also important that to the extent that this really matters to you and you have something to say, public has been very involved in the regulatory process. There are always public workshops going on. CARB is definitely opening up portals for feedback. I've had clients that have participated in this, and you should do it this way because of that. And CARB is actively seeking this feedback. Its most recent workshop was the end of March, and on these new kind of emissions concept, it says, we want to hear from you. So definitely think about becoming involved and voicing your opinion, because you guys are the ones that are actually going to have to comply with this. And so CARB needs to understand what is and isn't feasible from your perspective. And then finally, with the litigation, it is important, but don't rest on the laurels of that. I certainly wouldn't advise, or I wouldn't say that a wait and see approach with the litigation is necessarily the best compliance strategy for anyone right now. So, but it is relevant. So that's all I have. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much for that overview, Kelly. I found that really helpful to kind of get more context about those two pieces of legislation there. And not seeing any questions in the Q&A box, so just going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks to all of our remaining participants. I'm sure we had some people who had to jump at 1:30, but yeah, thanks to everyone who joined us for this one. Next webinar will be on April 23rd, and thank you to NEBC and all of our speakers.
Good. Thank you, Kat. As you can tell, there's a lot of information to cover. We've got this part 2 coming up. And with that, that concludes this event. If you had to cut out, we're going to obviously have this available for you via video recording, and then we'll get the presentations out right away. So again, thank you for joining. And again, thank you, Maul for coordinating.